Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at this very early hour, especially for our guests from the West Coast. Thank you very much. Today we have with us members of the commission of the Knight Commission on Trust, Media, and Democracy, which was a major effort that Knight funded. The Aspen Institute, our friends at the Aspen Institute, helped organize this commission in 2017 when our board asked us to take on the challenge of the declining levels of trust in the news media and in our democratic institutions. So we were very fortunate to work with the Aspen Institute and Charlie Firestone, who is right here, who leads the communications program at Aspen. The work of the commission focused in three areas: journalism, technology, and the role of the citizen, because the commission found that it's we, the people, who must address the challenge of the declining levels of trust in the news media and in our democratic institutions. And so that is why a theme that ran throughout all of the recommendations was the very important role of responsibility. Technology companies need to take responsibility, journalists need to take responsibility, and all of us need to take responsibility to address these very deep concerns that are affecting the health of our democracy. So joining me this morning are members of the journalism working group. And we're also delighted that Mirta Ojito is here, the Senior Director of Standards at NBC Universal, where Mirta works for Telemundo, helping journalists address ethical challenges to help further discuss these recommendations. So to my right, I'm delighted to introduce Joanne Lippmann. Joanne Lippmann served on the commission while she was executive editor of USA Today Network, which includes USA Today, the news organization, and 109 local newspapers and news organizations around the country. Before joining USA Today, Joanne worked for 22 years at the Wall Street Journal and was also the founding editor at Condé Nast for Portfolio. Joanne is the author of a brand new book and has been called That's What She Said, and has been around the country meeting with organizations and groups and speaking to company and corporate leaders about the very important role of gender in the workplace, in our culture and society. Next to Joanne is Micelle Stewart, who I always love to share, was the managing editor of the newspaper in Akron, Ohio, the Akron Beacon Journal, which is the newspaper that Jack Knight ran for many years, where the Knight brothers built their newspaper organization to 26 newspapers around the country. Mizell is the Senior Director of Strategy at USA Today Network and is working very closely with us at Knight Foundation on helping accelerate the digital transformation of 109 newspapers and news organizations around the country. Mirta Ojito, I mentioned, is in charge of standards, the Senior Director for Standards at Telemundo. Mirta and I had the privilege of working together at the New York Times, where she was part of the Pulitzer Prize-winning team on the Race Project in 2001, I think. Was it 2001? And yeah, I should stop using years. Yes, in 2001. And Mirta, before joining Telemundo a few years ago, was a full professor at Columbia Graduate School of Journalism and is the author of 2 books. And love to introduce Charlie Sykes, who is a member of the commission along with Joanne and Mizell. Charlie spent almost 2 decades as a conservative talk show radio host, a very popular talk show radio host in Wisconsin, is now a commentator for MSNBC, and is now one of the leaders and founders of a very new and exciting news organization in Washington, D.C. called the Bulwark, and it is just began within the last month. It's an online digital startup, and Charlie was joined in starting this news organization with colleagues from the Weekly Standard, which just recently closed its doors. So right out of the Weekly Standard, within, my goodness, days, weeks, the reporting staff and folks were reporting on the Bulwark. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the journalism recommendations first, and Micelle Stewart, who with Rainey Aronson from Frontline, was the co-chair of the working group on journalism. So Mizell, I'm hoping that you can summarize
Absolutely.
For our audience.
Thanks, Jennifer, and good morning, everyone. We put together recommendations for journalism in 4 areas. And let me just say, just as a preamble, the commission worked for almost 2 years, took testimony and received input from dozens of experts, as well as individuals who are very interested in this concept of rebuilding trust in the media and rebuilding trust in institutions. And it's been a really collaborative process. And the recommendations are really in 4 areas: transparency, rebuilding local journalism, innovation, and diversity and inclusion. And when we talk about transparency, we actually coined a phrase, calling it radical transparency. The idea behind radical transparency is pushing back on journalistic norms of, we will do it and people automatically know what we do and why we do it. We believe that one reason for the decline in trust has been the resistance in journalism circles to actually explain journalistic practices, journalistic norms, and essentially why we do what we do. And we think it's a radical concept to say to journalists, explain yourselves. Tom Rosensteil, who was one of the folks who helped us formulate our thinking in this process, Tom is the executive director of the American Press Institute. Tom said, rebuilding trust is not a matter of changing or adapting journalistic values. It is a matter of adapting journalistic practices, and we really took that to heart. When it comes to the trust in journalism as it relates to the interactions people have with journalists, what we've seen in local journalism is a significant decline in the number of journalists in communities around the country. And so we feel that rebuilding local journalism, putting more boots on the ground in communities across this country is an imperative. When you know a journalist, I like to say, when I was in local newsrooms, when I ran into people in the supermarket, when I saw people in church, people didn't see me as some of this nameless, faceless elite known as the media. What they saw was one of their neighbors and one of their friends. And so the decline in local has meant that fewer people truly interact on a personal level with journalists. And so we recommend rebuilding local journalism through new nonprofit and for-profit models. We are grateful to the Knight Foundation and others in this room who are seeding projects such as Report for America, the American Journalism Project, because those are all aimed at putting more people in communities to practice accountability journalism. Collaboration and partnerships are also very critical to rebuilding local journalism. Both nonprofit organizations working together, for-profit organizations like ours collaborating with nonprofit organizations. I was struck by a statement Evan Smith made, co-founder of the Texas Tribune yesterday. He said, we're not about competition, we're about collaboration, and that's really the key. Innovation is about embracing technology. Many of us who come from legacy journalism environments, are rightly concerned about the influence of technology as it has related to local news and information, but we almost have to run to the fire. We have to embrace technology when it comes to two things. One is using technology to combat misinformation and disinformation, and truly mastering the digital transition from legacy platforms to the way people are consuming news and information today. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about diversity and inclusion. We want a journalistic workforce and journalism organizations to reflect America. In terms of race and gender, but also to reflect America in terms of socioeconomic status. Journalism has gradually become, we fear, more of an elite profession. And when that happens, we don't have the authentic voices of people in marginalized and underserved communities. One of the organizations we looked at as part of the work of the commission was City Bureau in Chicago, because it elevates individuals' voices from neighborhoods in urban Chicago and helps teach them journalistic practices. And they are participants in their own local information ecosystem. So those are just the highlights.
Thank you. Thank you. Charlie, a big part of the discussion was about bias and perceived bias as part of Knight's effort to take on these questions and challenges. Knight funded the Gallup organization to conduct polling to really understand how widespread and to the extent of the perception of bias. And what might journalists do to address these very real concerns?
Well, first of all, I want to really thank everybody for letting me participate in the Knight Commission, and the deliberations were fascinating. We had a very diverse group of people, and I did change my mind on a lot of things. But I come from this from a different point of view, having a foot in both worlds, being a conservative talk show host, but also being on MSNBC. I sort of see the alternative realities that we've created. Look, in a lot of ways, this is the best of times and the worst of times. I mean, some of the best journalism of our lives is being published on a daily basis, some of the best storytelling, some of the best investigative reporting. And at the same time, as you point out, you have 40% or more of the public that just shuts it out, that just will not believe anything. And I think this is the challenge. This is why it is so grave. Not only have you had local journalism being hollowed out, but this distrust is ingrained. It's been building for a long time, and now it's been weaponized, politically weaponized. So I do think that among the things that the media has to do, and this is a very hard thing to do, and I understand this, is to engage in some introspection. Look in the mirror and ask, why do so many people think that we are biased? And clearly, this is difficult because you don't want to give oxygen to the kinds of demagogic attacks that you're getting from a president who says we are the enemy of the people, right? But on the other hand, you have to say, were there things that was done by the media that fed this over 20 or 30 years? And I have to say that I think that there has been a lack of introspection, a lack of serious questioning about the question of bias. And I think it's important to do that if you're going to fight back against what I think is the very grave threat to First Amendment rights, free press rights, from a weaponized political environment, including when you have a Supreme Court justice who's talking about overturning Times versus Sullivan. This is a dangerous time because the consensus, the public consensus for press freedom has been eroded in terms of bias. Now, what do I mean by bias? I mean, in part, it's, and I'm sorry to repeat the phrase that I've used before, but I do think that a lot of people in newsrooms do not feel that they are biased in the same way that fish don't know they're wet. Because they are surrounded by people who hate the same people they hate. They look down on the same people. They have the same political views. They regard their point of view as the default setting, and people who disagree with them as outliers. And I think that that needs to be challenged. I also think that the media, and this is what makes it so difficult right now, I think the media needs to be aggressive. It needs to push accountability. I actually think it is a good thing that the New York Times says that the president makes false claims, puts the word lies in headlines, because I think you have to label a lie a lie. I think this is a good thing to do. But I would also strongly say two other things. Number one, really make sure you get it right, because every error is absolutely weaponized and feeds this vortex of distrust. And secondly, if you're going to hold people to tough standards, which I think you need to do, make sure they are consistent standards. Something that is a felony for a Republican should not be a misdemeanor for a Democrat. If you're going to say that Donald Trump lies, which I think you ought to do on a regular basis, make sure if, I don't know, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says something that's untrue, that you also hold her to the same standard. And so I do think that this is something that needs to be addressed. The commission, I think, did wrestle with this, did discuss this, does acknowledge it, and going forward, I think that's going to be part of what it's going to mean to do this. Also, I just throw out, we had very interesting discussions about diversity, and there's no disagreement, I think, on the Commission on Diversity. But when I was coming up, before I was in radio, I was actually a reporter for the Milwaukee Journal, which at one time had, 200, 300 plus reporters. We covered local government. I lived in Milwaukee City Hall on a regular basis. I don't think there's any reporter that does what I used to do. But also, in the newsroom, I used to sit next to people who went to bars with cops, who grew up in blue-collar families, who really knew the community. So when we're talking about diversity, I also think that diversity of points of view, diversity of income is also very, very important. And I would also just challenge those of you in public media who are doing such incredibly good work as storytellers and who will play an absolutely essential role in dealing with the news deserts and the ghost newspapers. And if there's any solution to this, it's going to be new partnerships, new economic models. Ask yourself, how many conservatives do you have on the air in your newsroom? How many conservatives do you know? How many evangelical Christians do you know? And the answer to that question may tell you a little bit about why there is, the challenges ahead. This is not an indictment. This is not to say, you need to be in sackcloth and ashes. But if you want to rebuild trust, you have to ask those questions. I'm sorry, that was a long answer. But.
Yeah, no, and just to add to that, what we also know, of course, is the low levels of trust over many years, earned low levels of trust among people of color in many communities around the country because newsrooms are not reflective in many parts of America of the people and of the communities that they cover. So there's just much work that has to be done to rebuild that trust. And one of the reasons why so much of our effort is focused on local is that there is a belief that we can help support building trust one community at a time. So Mirta, there's such an emphasis in the recommendations on reminding people about journalists, about the value and importance of ethics, and we exchanged words before this about we really have to remind journalists of the importance of ethics and radical transparency. And what are you seeing on the ground in your work? And something else I would love for you to talk about is there are high levels of trust among the audience for Spanish language media. And so what might we learn from Spanish language media to rebuild trust?
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. So I think ethics, we've always had ethics. I also, not only did I teach, but I was also a student at the Graduate School of Journalism, and I don't remember a time when we didn't teach ethics. It was always a course, as far as I can tell. But I think it's now more important than ever to remember those lessons. I think it's important to develop, if the organization doesn't already have them, a set of standards, guidelines. We have them at NBC. It's a booklet about this thick. I brought it on Monday. I actually showed it to the audience. I didn't bring it today, unfortunately. But I was surprised, actually, when I'm a print person all my life, and when I went from print to television, I was surprised to see, at least at NBC, that they follow very, very strict guidelines. And I say they because at the time it was they, now it's we. We follow very strict guidelines at NBC and at Telemundo. We train our employees, not necessarily new employees, all employees. So employees who've been there for 20 years get the same training, updated every 18 months or so, sometimes every year. And every new employee gets the guidelines, which are updated every year or so. So it's a very rigorous process, and I think every news organization ought to do so. We are transparent within our organization about our guidelines. We don't, however, release them to the public, and this has given me a lot to think about. It's something that I'm going to bring up in my own organization. I do believe that the New York Times, that also has very, of course, rigorous guidelines, has them online, and everybody can read them. Other organizations do as well, so, but we don't. And it's something to think about, because I think it's important for the public to understand the process we go through. I do like the concept of radical transparency. I think it's a great idea to let people know what we do and how we do it. And in fact, before I even knew about the work of the commission, I was not part of the commission, I had come up on my own with an idea that I didn't actually share with anyone. I had called somebody at Miami-Dade College, but she hadn't called me back to tell her my idea, which was to reach out to the community, because I thought I had an encounter with someone. I'll tell you quickly an anecdote. Someone who told me that a reporter had, he witnessed a murder-suicide, and reporters attempted to talk to him because he knew the victims, and he refused to. But the story he would have told reporters would have humanized the victims in a way that would have been healing for the family. And when I told him so, he understood. And I realized that nobody had actually explained to him the power of journalism. And I thought, if we could tell people what we do and how we do it, and why we speak to witnesses of crimes, and people who are grieving, because people don't understand why we do that, maybe it'll go better. So I think it's important. I also think it's important to tell people in this concept of radical transparency, when we're writing stories and we're producing stories, to tell them not only what we know and how we know it, but equally important now is what we don't know. Right? Because often we leave that out. But I think we need to tell people right now what we don't know and what we're working on getting. This is what we don't know, but we're working on getting it. To be completely transparent about the process. And as to your second question, I think I don't have the numbers. I looked for the numbers, but my instinct tells me that there's a greater level of trust in Spanish language media. And I think it's easy to imagine. I mean, think about it. If you are an immigrant, a newly arrived immigrant in a country, you don't speak the language, who are you going to turn to for information on flu shots, a Mizell outbreak, snow day? You turn on the television and you realize that your local news in at least 2 networks are telling you what you need to know. Radio, newspapers. You're going to trust them, right? These are people that, I mean, it's like the Walter Cronkite of its time. We have it in at least 2 networks. So there is a greater level of trust. And in Spanish language television, we really do meet people where they are. And what do I mean by that? Often we hold, for example, right after the election, at Telemundo, we held town hall meetings. We wanted to know how the community felt. I mean, there was a lot of fear. People were afraid. And that was the word we used, right? Just dealing with the fear. And so we held town halls in a lot of cities that were, eminently Hispanic cities, in Chicago, in LA. We talked to people, and our main anchor Jose Diaz-Balart, talked to people. We brought lawyers. The main topic, of course, was immigration. What's going to happen now? And we gave them a voice, and we allowed them. We served as a conduit between the lawyers who had the information and the audience. And so I think when you do that, you get closer to the people. You're providing a service, but it's also a source of stories. You're mining the community for ideas, because you're filling their pulse. You get to know what they're thinking about.
That old-fashioned thing called listening.
Exactly.
That
listening to the community.
Trick. One of the other major concerns about trust, of course, is the impact that technology has had on our news and information ecosystem. And Joanne, as a member of the commission, this was discussed a great deal in both the journalism working group and the technology working group. And the technology group made several recommendations, including recommending that our data, that the technology companies that are harvesting all of our private personal data, that they be information fiduciaries. In the same way, your accountant plays that role in your management of your finances. And also that there needs to be not just political advertising, but all advertising. There needs to be transparency about who is paying to serve you information in your newsfeed. And finally, the really important role that technology companies need to play in terms of battling the spread of misinformation and disinformation. And Joanne, this was an issue that you came back to again and again on the commission about how important it was for journalists and for technology companies to take on this problem.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I actually think it is perhaps one of the most, if not the most significant recommendations that crosses over between the journalism and the technology areas. And just to give you guys a little bit of a peek into the commission deliberations, you're seeing the journalists who are all in violent agreement with one another. We also had academics, lawyers, attorneys, and technologists. We had people from Google and Facebook and elsewhere on the commission, and boy, did we have some spirited discussions. But a lot of it is because, if you think about it, media and the technology companies, particularly the big guys, Google, Facebook, Twitter, we really are frenemies. And on the one hand, we have tension over financial models, over business, because the vast majority, 80% of new advertising dollars go to them instead of to us, which is one of the reasons we are all in financial straits. But another and very, very significant issue for our future is this misinformation and disinformation. And it's really important to understand the role of the technology firms in allowing that to spread, and that, of course, erodes trust. So, for example, one of the things that we learned was there's a lot of research being done on how mis and disinformation spreads, and it turns out that false information spreads actually much more quickly. I believe it's twice as quickly as true information. And in addition to that, there's been research into what is the emotion that spreads most virally. And you might think that it's joy and puppies and babies, but it's not. It's anger. And so therefore, you think about the technology firms and the platforms, what is their business model? Their business model is they want information to be viral. That is actually how they make money. What kind of information is viral? The most viral information, it turns out, is this sort of false information that inflames anger and division. And so we really had some very difficult conversations about this, and it is the onus on the technology firms as well as on the journalists to work together, to come together in a way that we have not before in order to combat that spread. It is really one of the primary reasons. I mean, we talk about bias, but really one of the most dangerous issues that are facing our democracy today is this spread of mis and disinformation. And I do think it was quite a victory, and I give so much credit to our colleagues on the technology side. If you look at those recommendations, they are pledging to use innovation, to employ innovation in order to try and figure out ways to stop the spread, the sharing of misinformation, and to stop the misinformation from appearing on their platforms. And so I do think that if we can carry through with that recommendation, we will go a long way toward restoring and repairing trust.
Thank you. No, absolutely. And Knight Foundation is looking to fund and support. There's an effort underway led by my colleague Sam Gill to support research to better understand how we can make sure that we don't have a news and information ecosystem that's flooded with misinformation and disinformation. Now, Mizell, when we look at the journalism working group's recommendations, there were also some really great ideas that came out of it to help improve the flow of an increase in accurate information, especially at the local level. And everyone will get a chance at the next panel to hear from John Thornton, who is a co-founder of the American Journalism Project, which was formally announced and launched yesterday with $42 million in support that has been raised in the last 6 months. And the American Journalism Project is a philanthropic venture capital fund that is designed to address the big problem that we have in so many local communities, and that is a lack of capital to support great civic, public service, mission-driven journalism. And in addition to providing that capital, the American Journalism Project will do what every good VC firm does, and that's to make sure that the not-for-profit organizations that they will be investing in have the strategic guidance, the business expertise, and the technology expertise to help make sure that journalism, which, as Joanne said, the business model for journalism has been just dismantled in the last 15 years, or actually I think some would say it started before that, is a really great path and promise for a whole new future on building a future for local news. And Mizell, maybe you could share with the audience some of the other ideas that the commission recommended.
Before I get to the other ideas, I do want to paint you a picture about the kind of situation that these recommendations are really designed to address. I had a conversation at breakfast with my friend Bob Moore. Bob's a former editor of the El Paso Times and who now is deeply engaged as a freelancer in coverage of issues surrounding the border and the wall and U.S. immigration policy, family separation, all of those issues that are really at the forefront of the national debate, but they're unfolding in a local community. And I want you to picture El Paso as a community. And Bob said something to me this morning that was quite surprising. He said, every journalist in El Paso is supported by advertising. I want you to think about that for a second. Every journalist in that community is supported by advertising. Well, what entities, as Jennifer mentioned, or Joanne mentioned, are getting 80% of all new advertising revenue? Well, they're the large-scale digital platforms. And so those resources are being taken out of local communities and are going to the platforms. And not only, and I want you to think about this too, El Paso is not a small community, but it also has zero public media. Zero public media in El Paso, Texas. And so when we talk about new ways of capital formation, how do we create a new path to sustain local journalism? I would say a community like El Paso would be ground zero for how do we create a new form of media and a new way of financing local journalism. But along with our other ideas, we have talked a great deal about partnerships, and particularly partnerships that take, say, national entities such as Frontline, executive produced by Commissioner Rainey Aronson, and then pair journalists at Frontline with local journalists around the country, and then figuring out ways that through that collaboration we can put more resources back into local communities. In the for-profit world, the USA Today Network, which I'm a part of, and Joanne was a part of until last year. The whole idea is how do we leverage local by pairing local journalists with those working on the national level. Other ideas that we talked about, I mentioned City Bureau in Chicago. This is a nonprofit that brings people from local neighborhoods to actually cover stories in their communities, in their neighborhoods, on a day-to-day basis. And we've talked about Report for America and similar models that, again, put resources back into local communities. We are literally at a point where my company now is being targeted by a hostile takeover effort by a private equity firm. And there's a real tension between those who lead news companies and care about journalism and those who lead news companies and would employ what is referred to in the financial world as a harvest strategy. You're just going to harvest as much as you can from the assets and then either sell them or shut them down. And I don't think any of us want that to happen when it comes to journalism entities. And so that's why new models of capital formation, we talked about public benefit corporations, such as the Philadelphia Inquirer, which is now part of the Lenfest Institute, and making shareholder value part of the equation, but not the end-all, be-all of the business enterprise, and that's where public benefit corporations come in. Another potential model that we talked about takes as its example community development corporations. Community development corporations are formed in a lot of local communities around the country to handle issues such as job training and education in underserved communities. Could that same model be adapted for local information at a neighborhood level?
And on our next panel, you're going to hear from folks from the place-based Gates Family Foundation in Colorado, which responded to the crisis at the Denver Post as a foundation in engaging journalists and the community on how to build new models for journalism. And the Commission's work and deliberations clearly helped inform Knight's approach and strategy, and our announcement last week. It's all blending together. It's all good. Last week that Knight is increasing its commitment to $300 million. We're doubling our commitment to journalism and to research of battling misinformation and disinformation over the next 5 years. And many of the projects that we funded came out of discussions such as Report for America, because as Mizell said, it's critical that that we are all supporting, all of us as funders who care about our communities, putting more people on the ground. The ProPublica local reporting project, which is partnering, which is funding reporters and journalists all on the ground in cities and towns across the country, and providing those journalists and those newsrooms with the data journalism resources and investigative reporting expertise that ProPublica brings to all of its outstanding journalism. And other investments include the Solutions Journalism Network, which we have just seen such success in Philadelphia, in the Mountain West, just across the country, just help change the conversation about beyond just reporting the problems, but also evidence-based reporting on what some solutions might be. That has turned out to be a really great example of how journalists can engage with their communities around issues.
I say something now that you mentioned ProPublica. That reminds me of an article I read there once. I think it was September of last year. And I remember that article as I was thinking about this panel on Monday. It was a conversation between two women, reporters who had worked both in Spanish and English, as I have. And one of them made a comment that I thought was really, really smart, and I had never thought about it that way. And after I read it, I thought, it was one of those things that, of course. And she said, traditional outlets do their reporting top to bottom, meaning they get a report, a study, talk to somebody in a position of power, and then they go to the communities to get the quotes. And Spanish language media go to the communities, are in the communities, they're embedded in the communities. They find out what's going on, and then they make the other calls, and then they find the studies, and they get the, and I thought, yes, of course, that's the difference. And I realized, I felt that imbalance in my own life as I went from the Miami Herald to the New York Times. But I didn't have the words, I didn't have the language to say that. I didn't know back in 1996 when I made that transition. Because even though I was working in the Miami Herald in English, I was in my community. But I didn't know when I made that transition what was happening. And I remember once going to, an editor gave me a report of the dangers of mercury in the Hispanic community. And I was told to find examples and to go do it. So mostly they meant in the Dominican community in Washington Heights. And I'd never been to Washington Heights. So I had just gotten to the New York Times. So I went to Washington Heights and began doing what I know to do, which is knocking on doors. And to my surprise, always I'm surprised when people open their doors. I'm grateful, very grateful, and humbled. Some people, I mean, people were nice, but community leaders were like, the New York Times here? Now, because you have a report? It was a long time ago. I think the New York Times has changed. But I was like, well, you know, I have to do this. My editor sent me, I gotta do it.
Could I actually add an analogous situation? Because I think this is really important for local journalism. I had an amazing conversation with actually one of the USA Today Network editors who moved from running one of the Gannett's local papers to headquarters. And he said something that I think is really wise, which is he said, you know, sometimes you might be based in Monroe, Louisiana, or rural Michigan, But he said, you know, if you wake up in the morning and turn on NPR and get in your car, or you wake up in the morning, you watch, you know, MSNBC, get in your car, listen to NPR, get to the newsroom, and see your other fellow graduates from Missouri School of Journalism, you're really not in your community.
Right.
And it's so important to understand that you know, wherever you are, you actually have to be embedded into that community. It's sometimes our journalists are more connected to the larger journalism community than they are to their local communities.
And now you know why I refused to move to D.C. when you hired me at USA Today.
Mizell lives in Ohio.
I live right outside of Akron, Ohio.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. And Charlie, what do you think needs to be done in terms of, or what advice would you have as we look to support the rebuilding of local journalism?
Yeah, by the way, I also live in flyover country in Wisconsin. No, the extent of this problem is really dramatically highlighted in this report. And if you haven't seen Penny Abernathy's piece on the news deserts, it's however bad you think it is, it's worse than you think it is. In part because that documents the parts of the country where there are no local newspapers whatsoever. And then there are also the ghost newspapers, the ones that have been hollowed out. You know, the papers that used to have 400 staffers that now have 40 staffers. You know, really don't cover the local community in any way whatsoever. But if I could turn the focus just a little bit, because we're all focusing on journalism and the problems with journalism. You know, the whole point of this report was, of course, restoring faith in democracy and the media. What was the whole title of it? But so why do we want to rebuild trust in media? It's not an end in and of itself. It's because of the role media plays in civil society and democracy. I mean, truth is the oxygen of democracy. If you don't have that, nothing else works. So you need to have a credible, functioning media. But then you also need something else. You actually need to have an engaged citizenry that cares, that is knowledgeable. So, you know, as we sat over more than a year of deliberating like the misinformation and everything, everything that we recommend to deal with the misinformation, I agree with. However, I guess I'm a little cynical about our ability to stop that flow of misinformation. So the question is then, well, how can we create an immune system in the public? Why are there so many gullible voters that believe the misinformation? I mean, that's part of the problem. And that's why we also address the concept of citizenship. You know, and Charlie Firestone came up with the concept of, you know, the sovereign citizen. Look, we don't teach civics anymore. We don't teach history anymore. We're having debates about the rule of law to a public that is completely not engaged. We see this in voting numbers. So we do address that as well. The audience for this misinformation, that you actually have to educate the public in a variety of ways. We have to do something to revitalize a citizenry that will then be receptive to what a trusted media will give them. Our luncheon speaker yesterday said something that is immensely important, that I think cannot be underestimated. He quoted Hannah Arendt, who basically said something similar to what, when I was hosting the WNYC show, Indivisible, we had Garry Kasparov on the show, who's a former chess champion, world chess champion, Russian dissident. And I think he was channeling Hannah Arendt when he said, look, the point of all this misinformation and propaganda is not necessarily to get you to believe one thing or another. It's basically to attack your critical sensibility. It's to annihilate truth, so that at the end of the day, people are so overwhelmed that they don't know who to believe anymore, and they therefore don't care. And so they tune out everything that we're doing.
It's almost the introduction of doubt in civil society.
Exactly. And the fact is that our brains as human beings are not necessarily wired to find out what is true. You know, maybe we are wired in order to confirm our bias, to strengthen our ties to our tribes. And so the whole point of civil society is to push back against that, to make you get out of that. That maybe the default setting of people is to believe what they want to believe. And in the modern society, all you need to do is, you know, go on Twitter or turn on Fox News or turn on MSNBC, and you will have all of your worldview confirmed. If you don't want to believe something, you will find something. So we are up against a much greater challenge. And so to put all the weight on the media, I think is, well, they deserve a lot of weight, there's no question about it, but we also need to recognize that we have a population that believes a lot of stuff that turns out to be bullshit. And most troubling, there's a large part of the population that may know that it's not true, and they may not care. So we have a really deep rebuilding process here.
So we'd love your questions and comments and suggestions. So there are folks all around the room. So as the mics get passed, Charlie, could you just summarize the recommendations on the citizenship? We talked about technology, we talked about journalism. What were the Commission's recommendations for citizens?
Really threefold. A real educational commitment to civics education and media literacy, that by the time every child in this country is 13, they need to be digitally and media literate. By the age of 18, before they vote, they need to be civic literacy. We actually throw out the idea of requiring high school graduates to be able to pass the U.S. citizenship test, that actually Americans should know as much about their own country as people who are coming here and want to become Americans. That's number one. Number two, we need to create more civic spaces for people to actually gather outside of Twitter and Facebook. I think there's a tremendous role for civic institutions, including libraries, to be able to do that. And finally, we need to find some way to have people connect with that shared experience of being a citizen, perhaps giving back through a much expanded, revitalized, voluntary program of national service. We did debate whether it should be mandatory. I think we came down very solidly on the side of it being voluntary. But I think that this is one of those ideas whose time has come. People like General Stanley McChrystal have been talking about the power of national service in binding Americans together, but also as a way of having some sort of shared experience and shared commitment. And there are many models for everything that I've just described. You know, in the area of civic literacy, there are outstanding programs that are being developed, media literacy. They don't need to be invented from scratch, but this is something, frankly, that the nonprofit philanthropic community can play a major role in pushing to say, you know, we are living through the consequences of failing to teach these things, and not just to kids, to adults as well. We're living through the consequences of bowling alone, and that we need to somehow find ways to reestablish that concept of the sovereign citizen.
We have a lot of questions, so we'll start here.
Yes.
1, 2, 3, and 4, and then we'll come around.
Good morning, and thank you so much. My name is Allison Ashan. I'm with the Blandin Foundation in very northern Minnesota, where we have snow up to here right now. So we work exclusively in small rural places. And in Minnesota, we're really proud to support a program called the Editors and Publishers Leadership Program. I just wanted to name that and point it to you as you think about civics and journalism, because editors and publishers are leaders too. My question is, as you talked a lot about bottom-up reporting, how about bottom-up information collecting and deliberation as part of the commission? What did you do to go to those local sources to inform your work?
We took testimony from a wide cross-section of experts. I can't say that we had necessarily a roundtable of readers, but Knight commissioned extensive research among news consumers and individuals throughout the country on those issues of trust, and partner with Gallup in order to do that. I love that's one of the things I miss from being a local newspaper editor, is that sense of community leadership from that place. And I commend you for the leadership program that you support.
Yeah, and one thing, the Knight Commission did not meet in Washington, D.C. until the launch. So it was very nice to see Aspen's headquarters just a month ago, but traveled around the country, including to Nashville and Wisconsin, and right here in Miami to hear from people, to share their very local concerns, and would love to talk to you more. There's so much that needs to be done to address the news deserts and concerns about information needs in rural America. Number two.
Good morning. Frank Sesno, along with CNN, now with the School of Media and Public Affairs, George Washington University. I'm glad you didn't start at Washington. Charlie, you talked about the importance of recognizing citizen responsibility, and that is huge. You also talked about the need for media introspection. Media is a very plural word. In your work and in looking at some of the best practices that you've seen, what does that media introspection look like? We're going to have a retreat of every media organization in the world and come up with a Bill of Rights. I doubt it. And how does that media introspection, should that recognize and feed the citizen role in all of this? Is there a way for that media introspection to both look within and look out and be part of a solution here?
That's a good question. And I think it goes back to something that you heard about, is that people need to start listening a little bit more. I do think that one of the questions to say is, okay, are we listening to the people in our community? Or have we created this bubble of our own? So I think that's where you start, where you not only address the question of bias, but you address the question of, are we engaged with the real world, or are we basically in a circular something or other that I'm not going to say. And I do think that the one thing that I think the media does need to do a better job is explaining what it does and reminding people of the role that it plays in a democracy. I mean, this is part of the radical transparency of saying we do this thing, not to necessarily because we want to sell newspapers, but because we think this is important. We work for you. We are in the public service. So I do think that that's something else that they could do as part of the citizens. We inform you so that you can keep this democracy. You can keep the republic that was given you. In terms of the introspection, look, I have seen both sides of this. I know that a lot of people, and I really fully understand this, especially in the current age with the current attacks, just simply do not want to acknowledge that any of the criticism is in fact true, that there is a bias, and it tends to be more of a pack mentality, a uniformity of opinion. And I do think that those questions that I ask, I'm not asking for retreat. I'm not asking for navel gazing. It's just that every once in a while, it's worthwhile going, what did we miss? What did we do to feed this, if anything? Are there anything that the critics said about us that might be true? And that is one of the most painful things to do. I do understand it, but I think it's essential.
But under the guise, let me add this, under the guise of radical transparency, one of our recommendations is holding a summit of news leaders so that we can put together essentially a menu of best practices and get some level of consensus on what transparency means. And when we say this is what we do and this is why we do it, that we're pulling together a critical mass of news organizations to make that happen.
And I would just add, there's a great new book. It's called The Forgotten. It's written by Ben Bradley Jr., and it focuses on a county in northeastern Pennsylvania which voted for President Obama and then voted for President Trump. And I think that this just in-depth look and listening project that produced not just the voices from this county, but really great reporting on the impact of various economic and demographic trends. It's must reading for journalists before 2020 and for community foundation leaders, just to help understand where people are coming from during this time. Over here.
Hi, thank you. I'm Alex Newman. I'm a freelance journalist. And you guys mentioned, and I agree, that journalists are often insulated in their own little communities and tribes, and we kind of don't interact as much as we should with the outside world. And I think the 2016 election was a good confirmation of that. A lot of us were shocked. But obviously there's a lot of misinformation out there, but how do we guard against kind of truthful information or information coming from a different opinion or worldview getting caught up in these dragnets and drowned out, especially, from marginalized communities, people who don't necessarily have a voice. We don't hear it in our talks. So how do we prevent that from getting caught up in the dragnets?
Well, go ahead.
That really gets down to the diversity of voices in the newsroom. And when we talk about diversity, it really isn't just, we typically hear about, well, you need to have gender and racial diversity. We need diversity of viewpoints, of political viewpoints. We need diversity of class in our newsrooms. I think that's something that is really underlooked. The idea that, if you have even if you have a racially, ethnically, gender diverse newsroom, but everybody kind of grew up in a nice middle-class household and went to college, you don't have that sort of diversity of experience and connection to these communities, and that is absolutely essential. And by the way, one other diversity I would add is of age. I've been out on the speaking tour on all about gender, but I will tell you that when you speak to audiences of 25-year-olds versus 50-year-olds, you see an entirely different world. And it's so important to recognize that within your newsrooms and to be able to call on those people and to hear the voices of those who might be underrepresented. And the one other thing I would say to news leaders is there are people who are underrepresented, whether you're talking gender, race, ethnicity, LGBTQ, often are afraid to speak up. They're afraid that they won't be heard. They're not part of the majority. And I would say, those are your best resources. Call on those people. Make sure that we bring them into the fold so that we can reflect their communities as well.
Let me add, though, that part of this is, to me, the influence of bad actors driving wedges within our society and using the tools that connect us to also divide us. And so I believe, and I think the commission concluded that the tech companies have a responsibility to target misinformation and disinformation, but also government has a responsibility to do that as well.
Good morning. My name is Julio Ricardo Varela. I'm a journalist at Futuro Media. Just on Charlie's point about coverage and how we are, as an industry, are covering a presidency that's actually good for business. Right, and I would love to hear Mirta also from a Spanish language perspective. So my question is, when we do breaking news and we let our national leader speak for 50 minutes endlessly, I feel like I'm in a Latin American country sometimes, and I'm watching Fidel Castro or Hugo Chavez, which is what state-run television is in Latin America. So what do we do? Why are we covering this presidency in a traditional way when we all know that it's not a traditional administration? So I'm just curious, I want to hear from Mirta and Charlie or anyone else is like, what's the best way?
Well, let me give you a 30-second answer there. The practice of the cable networks in 2016 to carry Donald Trump unedited was media malpractice. And I think that in reacting to the new era, I think we'll look back on that the way I think the media looked back on the McCarthy era and realized, okay, our job is not to be stenographers, and our job is certainly not to give $1 billion worth of free advertising to one candidate. And I think that you want to talk about some introspection. I think the folks at Fox, forget. But CNN and MSNBC really need to ask themselves a lot of tough questions about that.
I think we do need to cover everything the president says, and I think the non-traditional ways in which he has chosen to carry his message need to be covered as well, and I mean social media. Those are presidential comments, and they merit coverage, and they need to be covered. And they speak for themselves, right? But we do need to be as critical of those comments and statements as we've always been of every president. I don't think we need to be harder or easier on him, or I don't think we need to mock him. I think we need to be as rigorous with him as we have been with any other president. And I think for the most part, the press has been that way. I don't think that was the behavior when he was a candidate, because very few of us took him seriously. But now that he is the president, I think for the most part that has been the behavior. He hasn't liked it, clearly, but the serious outlets have taken him seriously, and for the most part have taken him to task when it has merited it.
We have time for 2 questions. This one.
Hi, I'm Mary Kay Magstad. I had the audio journalism program at UC Berkeley, and I'm a former foreign correspondent for public radio for a couple of decades. I was struck by something that you said, Charlie, a little bit earlier in this conversation, where you said, well, we've been talking about journalism, but let's talk about the media. And I think, you know, Dana set for us a very interesting paradigm through which to look at terms. Journalists, by nature, do fact-based work. We verify. We do rigorous reporting. The media includes all kinds of different entities, including those who are very aggressively not fact-based, who in fact are doing what you talked about in terms of trying to sow doubt, trying to make people like not sure what reality actually is and to lose faith in being able to believe in anything. So I personally think we as journalists should take back our term and call ourselves journalists and let the rest of the media deal with the distrust that they've sown.
And just to add to that, one thing that Dana Boyd said yesterday was that there's a void, a data void. It's called journalism void on YouTube. So I challenge every journalist in this room to go make your videos right now and figure out YouTube search right now. And because, like, why the heck should people be turning to a data void in one of the most powerful social networks that exists to inform people, and it's empty of journalism. So thank you for that.
Our last
Yeah,
question.
well, let me just respond. I agree with you completely. I mean, I think there's a real imprecision in the use of the word media, and you're right. And maybe it should be a roadmap to rebuilding trust in journalism. And maybe that's that. I mean, somebody ought to pursue that specifically, separate it out. We are journalists. This is media. They're not the same thing.
I wanted to commend. I'm Ed Wasserman, Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley. I wanted to commend the Commission for a very thoughtful and illuminating report. One element I'd like to call to your attention, there's a tendency to view the public as an audience and to view public mistrust as kind of an audience review of the news. And I want to suggest to you that the question of mistrust and trust building perhaps hinges on our willingness to identify a very important part of the population of this country. And these are people who are covered by the news and are sources of the news. And we don't really understand, we don't really have any idea what they think of us. And they're an extremely influential part of the public because their lives have been shaped by the news. Nobody's gone back, circled back a few years later and said, well, how was it for you? How were you treated? What is your level of trust in the media? Has your life been improved? Has your life been damaged? Were people straight with you? Were they honest with you? Did they seem to have your best interests in heart? I love the idea of informational fiduciaries with respect to the platforms, but is there a fiduciary relationship between reporter and source? And going to the civic training element that I really applaud, you know, we train our students to read the news. We don't train them to pick up the phone and call a reporter when they think they know something about the news. So I guess my suggestion is there's a larger challenge here. First of all, it's an informational challenge to find out how we're doing among this absolutely integrally essential constituency out there. And then there's a question of whether, wouldn't it be terrible to find out that the people who are the most familiar with our practices are the least trusting of them? And if so, then perhaps the problem is looking at our news practices, the rituals of news gathering, and finding out whether they need to be reformed as a way to re-earn the trust of the public.
Excellent.
Those are both very good points. It reminds me when I was a local newspaper editor in places like Tallahassee and Akron, I used to send out accuracy surveys to people who were quoted in stories. to get to exactly that point and to try to get some insight into, were you treated fairly? Were you quoted accurately? Did the story reflect all of the information you provided to the reporter? And we use that as a way to both review performance, but also to make sure that we maintain credibility with our sources.
Excellent.
I'm going to close, though, on this thought. And that is that I, as a primarily local journalist who is now more exposed to Washington journalism, I have been amused over the past several years about a lot of the hand-wringing about how Donald Trump treats the press, because I've often said that anything that comes out of President Trump's mouth regarding a relationship with the media is no surprise to anyone who has covered a local city hall.
Thank you, Mizell. Thank you, all of